Welcome to another episode of the Bakari Sellers podcast. If you actually are watching this and you see me in a hotel room, shout out to the Marriott across the street from LaGuardia, because I'm about to go catch a flight as soon as I get done with this. And by the way, in the B terminal, they got this fried chicken restaurant I need to check out. It is delicious. But I'm here across from somebody who I can honestly say is a hero of mine. Oh, none other than Patrisse Cullors. What's going on, homie? How you?
I'm doing well. I just recovered from COVID like the rest of the world. And yeah, I'm more like on the 8th day, I was like, I survived.
You made it. You made it.
I felt like it was an initiation.
But look, I mean, you got 90 days where you can go out and do whatever you want to do now. You got them antibodies. You can hit Magic City. You can go out there and shake hands and hug people. You do whatever you want to do now. You good. Look, I've been waiting on this conversation. I'm glad to get on your calendar. You know, we start each one of our conversations by having our guests walk us through the arc of their career. And I think it's important for those people listening, so they know that you just didn't wind up where you wound up, how you got there. And you've had a career in education and activism and now entertainment as well. Can you walk listeners through those early experiences that helped shape your activism and your politics?
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I started to do community organizing work as a young person. The first organization I ever volunteered with, I was 16 years old. And I remember that feeling of being of service and how passionate I felt about it. And then when I learned that I can be of service and also challenge the government and change the material conditions for my community, that I think changed everything for me. And so from volunteering with this youth organization, I ended up going to a local org here, civil rights organization called the Bus Riders Union, where I fought the Metropolitan Transit Agency, that's not now just called Metro. The org that I was with sued them on transit racism and basically saying that bus riders were being treated as second-class citizens, and it was totally true. And we won that lawsuit. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So I spent almost a decade there. But during that time, I wanted to talk more about the impact police had on our communities. And so I helped launch the first campaign to really challenge the Los Angeles School Police Department here in Los Angeles. Many people don't know Los Angeles has its own school police, LAUSD. They're paid.
So they don't have school resource officers that are like sheriff's deputies.
They are police. They are armed police officers that have millions of dollars of a budget. And so we really challenged the school police. And that was, I think I was like, oh, this is my sweet spot. Like I really want to challenge the way we have looked at community safety in our communities. And from there, alongside my fine art career, I went back to art school at the middle of, running Black Lives Matter, and really realized, art it's really important to me. It's always been an important part of my process. I actually was a dancer as a young person and was in theater. And so I really wanted to continue my art practice. So I went back to school a few years ago and got my master's in fine arts. And that was really illuminating, because I remember sitting in school and thinking, wow, there's not a lot of conversation about the artist and the activist and the intersection of that. And I was meeting all these artists who are also activists, and yet there wasn't a real conversation. So, as you know, I started an MFA program, a Master's in Fine Arts program, for people like me, for artists and activists who needed a space to build their scholarship so that they can be in their practice. And I just graduated my first class of students with MFAs.
That's so dope. And we'll get to the book in a second, but I want to stay along this line of kind of art and activism. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your work as a professor and in the media and the importance of having us share our stories?
Yes. Academia is a very archaic place. It's where, in some ways, it's like, clearly wasn't made for us, wasn't made for Black people at all. The institution itself really privileges people who have resources. And I'm creating a program that's largely for, folks of color, Black women in particular, brown folks. And that's exactly who the program attracted at Prescott College. And I was really interested in working with people who had big ideas about their art and activism and wanted to intervene and challenge that world. And I think many of the students that I graduated this last year, I got to see, I graduated them in December, I got to see prolific projects come from these folks.
I mean, I just think about the fact that you are literally taking your activism out of the streets and but you're still being an activist, right? Even in different forms. The scholarship is amazing. When people Google you, the first thing they'll see is that you're credited as a founder of BLM. And if you had to assess how much progress the movement has made since the movement originated, an honest assessment,
yes.
What do you see as notable progress the movement has made? And are there policy areas where we thought we would have made more progress by now when the movement began, but we have not?
I'll start with the last question and then answer the first. So I'm really disappointed in the lack of movement around policing. That's been probably the largest conversation this movement has been, how do we reimagine public safety? And yet we have not seen at the scale that we need it, policing be challenged. In fact, there's a huge movement that happens, defund happens, and then we have, elected officials and former elected officials making fun of it, saying that it's ridiculous and that's not what we should be focusing on. And yet Black people are still being killed by the police. Black people are still being impacted by law enforcement and a prison and a jail system that has been about decimating our communities. So I would say that in that aspect, there's more work that needs to be done. But and then honest assessment around our victories, how powerful is it that in 8 years, this movement has been able to galvanize not just people in this country, but around the world. It is not a day that goes by that I don't see Black people around the world talking about and practicing what freedom could look like for us. And that to me is pretty epic. I've been to Australia, I've been to United Kingdom, I've been to so many different countries across Latin America where Black people are truly trying to create a movement that will not just free them now, but free us also in the future. And I think that is really, calls to some amazing success.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, Black Lives Matter is now on the tongue of so many individuals. I mean, you even had Mitt Romney in the streets saying Black Lives Matter. I mean, I'm not going to use that as a barometer of success, right. But you understand what I'm trying to say here.
Scale.
Explain to folk how Black Lives Matter works organizationally, because they think y'all got a headquarters.
Well, I'm no longer.
I know you're no longer, BLM. but explain for listeners how it's local chapters and blah.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Black Lives Matter is currently constructed is there's actually 3 organizations. There's a foundation, there's a grassroots entity that has chapters, and then there's a political action committee, there's a PAC. So there's 3 organizations that work across with each other, but also autonomously. And, when I was with Black Lives Matter, that was really important to be able to create different entities so those different entities can do the kinds of work that needs to be done. So, amazing work that comes out of Black Lives Matter Grassroots, which I'll shout out, which is really what holds the chapters inside of Black Lives Matter and really connects to the streets of what's going on in the streets, to also challenging, what's going on in local government as well as national government.
Let's talk about this book, 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World, an Abolitionist Handbook.
Yes.
What's it about and why did you choose to write this book at this time?
You know, it's funny, I started writing this book in 2019, so pre-pandemic, pre-uprisings. I didn't finish it until, well into 2020. But it felt really important to me to have an honest discourse about not just community safety, and so the role of the police and prisons in our society, but also to write something that could help us figure out how to be in relationship to each other. Abolition to me is not just about ending the police state and the prison state, but it's also about building a new culture that doesn't rely on punishment. We live in an economy of punishment, and I really, really want to push us to construct an economy of care. We know it's an economy of punishment because we see how the police and prisons interact with Black people in particular. But we also know it's an economy of punishment because we're living in a moment where the medical industrial complex is completely neglecting human lives. That's also punishment. Neglect is punishment. And so I'm really interested in building a new culture. Much of the work that I've been doing the last 20 years is culture building. We can get rid of institutions, we can get rid of laws, but if the culture still is racist, if the culture
let me put, first of all, your goal is beyond admirable, and I think that people need to understand. I mean, when you talk about the way that, because of my work that I do every day,
yes,
I actually see the role of medical neglect in our criminal justice system.
That's right.
Which together it poses this, conundrum where you're not physically or mentally healthy, and they talk about they rehabilitating you, and then they dump you out in the streets.
That's exactly right.
But culture. Let me ask you this: how do you change a culture that's been ingrained since 1776, when most people would push back? I don't necessarily agree. I am an optimist. I like you believe in what the unseen is. I believe in tomorrow, but some people would say generations just have to die off. It's not a cultural thing. People just have to die for us to change. Well, how do you feel about that?
Well, one, I wish that were true because it would make it so much easier, and we probably
could just wait, right? You just sit here and wait.
Cool, they're gonna die. That's not how it works though, because as you see, there's a whole generation of young radicalized white folks who are deeply invested in white supremacy. And so we actually have to change people. We have to change minds, we have to change hearts, but we also have to change laws and institutions. And we create a culture by having these kinds of conversations. We make it normal to talk about abolition. We make it normal to talk about medical neglect. We make it normal to talk about envisioning a new world. And then we put it into practice. That's so important. That's why this book is a handbook, because it's not just about talking about something, it's about also putting that thing into practice.
So let me ask you a question. What does abolition mean? Because when we talk about abolitionists, most people go to to who wrote the dictionary, Webster. What was that? What was his first name? Anyway, he was an abolitionist. Yeah, I bet y'all didn't even know that. I would have got it halfway right on Jeopardy. But Webster, for Webster's dictionary, I forget his name. We gonna call him Daniel. It might be David, whatever his name is. Webster was an abolitionist. That was talking about slavery. I interviewed a few people who talk about abolition in the form of our criminal justice system.
Yes.
What do you mean when you say abolition?
So for me, abolition is really simple. It's the getting rid of prisons, jails, courts, surveillance, and detention. That is abolition. It's a very simple definition. It is abolishing these things, it's getting rid of them. And though, as Ruthie Gilmore says, one of our abolitionist scholars, abolition isn't just about what we get rid of, but it's also what we imagine, and it's also about what we create. And so abolition is truly about building out, for me, new institutions of care, institutions that really rely on an economy of care. It's also about how we treat each other, how we show up for each other, how we're in relationship to one another.
What do you say to people? I mean, not those individuals who are diametrically opposed to you in thought and philosophy, but what do you say to those people who are normally on your team, like these old Black women who, when they hear abolition of those things that you said, it terrifies them because they feel like what Patrisse is saying is that when I dial 911, they ain't coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should have alternatives to 911. There's folks in Oakland who are working on that. We've created that in Los Angeles, an alternative to 911. I've actually used it to, get help from my brother. And I remember calling, and first time ever that I was like, oh, I don't have to call the police. I can call the, actual professionals who are going to help us in this psychiatric situation. I think what I would say to folks who are scared of this is what we have right now, we can all attest to, is not working. What would it mean to dream of something that we can experiment with and see if it works? I'm not saying let everybody out of prison right now. I'm not saying fire all the cops right now. What I'm saying, though, is we have to imagine a new world. I want my child to live in a world where he is not fearful of his life being taken from him by police, where he's not fearful of receiving 100 years in prison because of a criminal legal system that is racist and archaic. And I'm interested in imagining and experimenting with something that could be quite beautiful for all of us.
What do you want readers to get out of this book?
I want them to feel inspired. I want them to feel excited. I want them to see and read this book and think, oh, I didn't actually think about that. I didn't realize that could also be related to abolition.
And who's your audience? Everybody has an audience when they write the book. Like my first book, I was like, this book is for Black women. And then George Floyd happened and it changed. It became a book for people who were trying to learn and grow. What's the audience for your book?
This book is for a new generation of young people who are trying to figure out their role in this movement and what they do as abolitionists. And I also believe this book is going to be for everyone, because it's not just for abolitionists. I think anybody can learn from this book.
Throughout this process, this is a question I ask all authors. I asked Cicely Tyson this question. How did this book change you? When you were writing it, you always go through these moments where you're like, shit, I ain't even think like that, or I need to improve this, or, I need to do more of this. How did this book change you?
It changed me so deeply, because when you write a handbook, it means you also have to practice it, or at least you should be. There are so many times in this last year and a half where I would go back to these values and these steps and be like, Patrisse, you said in this chapter on this page.
You got to stop cussing people out, Patrisse. That's what you got to stop doing, okay? We got to focus on how to change them and change the culture. It don't say cuss their ass out on page 37, Patrisse.
That's exactly right. Like, I can't tell you how many times where I was like, ooh, let me reel that in, because
this book is aspirational. I'm not there yet.
There's moments of the book where I say that, like, listen, y'all, I know I'm saying this like on the forgiveness chapter, and that chapter is probably the hardest for a lot of people who are just, who I've sent it to. They're like, okay, wait, hold up. I can get into everything except for forgiveness. Like, do I really gotta forgive?
Exactly.
But that was a chapter that took longest to write, because that is something that I'm consistently working on, is this term that I call active forgiveness versus passive forgiveness.
Concrete things before I let you go. If you could do 5 things, and you can't say abolish, but if you could do 5 things to fix prisons in this country, so I guess I'm looking for a plan B here. What would you say?
CDCR receives a lot of money. This is for California, but I'll say federally across the country too. I would say some of that money should be shared with community organizations. And I've seen that work when those dollars get sent over to community organizations to help support people who are on the inside. I think we should get rid of the SHU and any kind of solitary confinement. I think that we should get rid of mandatory minimums.
I agree with that. I mean, if you have judges, let them do their work, right?
That's right. No one should be going to prison because, they were with somebody and that person had a gun and they didn't have it and they're getting a 10-year minimum because of that. We obviously should end the war on drugs, and that's directly related to prisons, because then we would, all those, I think there's thousands for sure. I don't know the exact number of people who are still in jail for marijuana. So all those folks should be released.
No question. I grow marijuana and represent people charged with marijuana. It's the most perverse thing ever.
Exactly. So that was 4. 5th one. The food is trash. So let's actually get people real food inside.
Food literally is trash.
Yes.
It's terrible. And it hasn't. I looked at a menu from Alcatraz in like 1947 recently. It hadn't changed. I mean, it's the same thing. I thought they might have ate better. I ain't even lying to you. So tell me this, where can people buy your book? How can they follow you on social media? All those good things.
Everywhere, but I would really encourage people to buy from indie bookstores, Black-owned bookstores. Try your hardest not to buy on Amazon. I know it's easy, it's one click away, but please order from your local bookstore. And you can find me anywhere on Instagram. I left Twitter because it's a terrible place, but I'm on Instagram and I'm on TikTok at OSOPE, Patrisse, Patrisse.
You know, I love you. I love all the work that you do. And as soon as this pandemic lets us be great, I'm coming out there and we drinking tequila,
yes!
Casa Azul, and you buying. So I feel good about it. That's what's happening. Thank you for joining the Bakari Sellers podcast. Patrisse Cullors, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Bakari.